Welcome to today's audio lecture. This lecture is on reader focus, business style, and business diction. This lecture will focus on how we can write reader focused messages, the best practices for business style, and finally the best practices for business diction or word choice, if you're unfamiliar with the word diction. Let's start out by talking about how we can write reader focused messages that meet our readers' needs, that speak to their wants and their expectations. To understand how we can write reader-focused messages, we first need to think about what writing is at its core. Writing is, of course, many things, but at its most fundamental level, writing is a relational act. It's about connecting with other human beings. And so good writing must be empathetic. Effective writers must be able to put themselves in their readers' shoes, think about what they want and what they need, and craft documents that speak to those wants and those needs and those expectations. But business communication and workplace communication more broadly pose additional challenges. We can't just write messages that speak to our readers' wants, needs, and expectations. We also have to do so in a timely fashion. Our readers are often busy, they're distracted, they're harried, and so we need to treat their time as more valuable than our own. When we unite these practices, this focus on our readers' wants and needs, and this respect for their time, we arrive at the foundational principle of business and workplace communication, and that is reader focus. Reader focus is so central to business communication, to workplace communication, that if you ever find yourself in doubt about how to approach a workplace message or a business communication challenge, just think about this principle. Think about your readers' wants, their needs, their expectations, and craft a document that achieves your goal while meeting those wants, needs, and expectations. But while this principle is incredibly powerful, it's also incredibly broad. And so we need to break it down into more manageable tips and strategies. And in a lot of ways, that's really the purpose of this course, to take the concept of reader focus and break it down into manageable, actionable tips and strategies. One of the best places to start is with this tip. Organize messages around your readers' needs, not your thought process. And we've all been there. We've sat down to draft a message, and what comes out on paper is essentially a narration of our thoughts on a given topic or theme. It's totally understandable, but it's not good. Instead, when we find ourselves writing in that way, we want to go back to the drawing board and reorganize our message around our readers' wants and needs. But while that tip is useful for producing reader-focused documents, it doesn't really help us produce reader-focused sentences, the basic building blocks of writing. To do that, we need to do something quite different. And one of the best things that you can do is to organize your sentences around you or we rather than I, to adopt a you perspective or a we perspective rather than an I perspective. Now, I'm not saying that the word I is evil or that it should be banished from your vocabulary altogether. Quite the opposite. Sometimes you just need to talk about yourself, something that you've done, something that you're thinking about. But if you have a good, elegant way to organize your sentence around your reader or your reader and yourself, you should take it. You should do it. Another good way to craft reader-focused sentences is by using polite commands and polite questions instead of I would like statements. Now, this tip is particularly useful in a workplace communication setting because oftentimes we are writing to instruct or ask a colleague or a direct report to take some kind of action. Please send this document. Please contact that client. And when we provide these calls to action, oftentimes we instinctively opt for I would like statements because at first glance they seem more polite. They seem to put the burden of the request on yourself rather than more bluntly stating the request as a command or a question. But in a sense, these I would like statements they're not just indirect, they're writer-focused. They're focused on you. They are, in a sense, selfish. A far more reader-focused way to frame these commands or requests is to just state them bluntly, to say, please contact the client, to say, could you please send me document X. It's a bit jarring at first, but ultimately it is a far more reader-focused way to construct a sentence. Now let's take a look at a message that fails to adhere to these principles. I'm not going to read this message in its entirety. Instead, I'd ask you to quit out of this audio lecture by hitting the escape button and resuming the lecture at the next slide once you've had a chance to read this message. You can resume the audio lecture by moving to the next slide and putting the slide deck back into presentation mode. Now, obviously, this is not the worst message ever. It's basically polite, it's basically kind, it uses standard English language grammar, but it nevertheless has some substantial flaws. And the first and most obvious of these flaws is the fact that the message is overwhelmingly writer-focused at the sentence level. It uses the word I or my no fewer than 8 times. But sentence-level writer focus isn't the only problem with this message. It also is writer-focused at the macro level. It is, in short, organized around the writer's thought process rather than the reader's needs. And so to begin revising this, we don't just need to take those writer-focused sentences and put Pradeep or the word you at the heart of those sentences. In addition to that, we also need to identify the real purpose of the message from Pradeep's point of view and eliminate all of the content that has to do with Marta's thought process. This slide here is my first attempt to address the writer focus problems with the previous version of this message. Obviously, this version is substantially shorter than the previous version, and at first glance, it is much more focused on Pradeep's needs. It does put the main purpose of the previous message to express support for his proposal for team happy hours at the front and center of this message. But this revised version still has some substantial problems. While it's reader-focused at the macro level, it's still rather writer-focused at the sentence level. This message is only 3 sentences in length, and yet we still use I, my, or me no fewer than 4 times here. So to really make this a truly reader-focused message at both the micro and macro levels, we need to make some further revisions. And so we ultimately wind up with this version here. Now, this version, it still retains a few instances of I, my, or me. That's fine, that's normal, that's natural. But in that critical first sentence, we've organized the sentence around you, around Pradeep, rather than around I. And even in the second sentence, where the subject of the question is I, we can still get away with that because questions are, by their very nature, reader-focused. They invite the reader to engage with the content and provide a response. And so now let's move on to our next section on best practices for business style. In this section, we're going to be talking about some business style tips that are incredibly important, but don't fit comfortably within either of our 2 other major style lectures. The first on clarity and concision, the second on continuity and cohesion. The first tip I want to focus on is the following: to use your writing to motivate action, even when the action you want your readers to take is as simple as reading your message. And what this means practically is taking those polite commands and those polite questions, which we talked about in the previous section, and putting them at the heart of pretty much every single message that you send. Reframing your messages so that they are always focusing on the action you want your reader to take after concluding your message. The next tip encourages you to maintain parallel phrasing in both lists and series. Now, admittedly, this is a somewhat technical term that not all of you will be familiar with, but to help you out, I've provided you with a quick and easy definition of what parallel phrasing means. To put it simply, parallel phrasing is the practice of using the same grammatical or syntactical structure for each item in a list or a series. And in simpler terms, that means that if you start a bulleted list with a command, with a verb statement, that you should use verb statements in all of the following bullet points. That if you start a bulleted list with a noun phrase or an item, that each of the subsequent items in that list should use the same structure. It's basically about making sure that each item in a list or series is consistent. Maintaining parallel phrasing not only makes your writing sound more consistent, it makes it easier to read. If your reader has to shift back and forth between different grammatical or syntactical structures within a list or series, it slows them down as they recalibrate their mind to understand the new approach to grammar or structure or style within each item in the series. Next, I would encourage you to ignore some of the advice that you probably received from your English or literature professors in high school or college, and to repeat words, phrases, and structures strategically. We are not in workplace communication trying to win Nobel Prizes for literature. Instead, we're simply trying to communicate meaning as quickly, efficiently, clearly, and effectively as possible. And to do so, we oftentimes want to repeat words and phrases and structures strategically. It makes our writing a bit boring, yes, but again, our readers are not consuming our writing for pleasure. They're consuming it because they have to. They're consuming it for practical purposes. And so repeating words, repeating phrases, repeating structures helps our reader move through the document as quickly as possible and grasp the meaning as clearly as possible. Next, I would encourage you to include specific targeted goodwill statements at the end of your messages. Never neglect the human touch in business communication. While you want to get to your point as quickly as possible, while you want to focus on and motivate action, you also want to take every opportunity you can to build strong, meaningful personal relationships with your reader. Treat every message as an opportunity for networking, because honestly, it is. But make sure that these networking statements, these goodwill statements, these little pieces of human kindness appear not at the beginning of your message, where your reader is looking for substance and content, but rather at the end. Now, in my previous comments, I primarily focused on the appropriate location for goodwill statements. I encouraged you to always locate those statements at the end of your message. But just as important as the location of your goodwill statement is the specificity of your goodwill statement. Avoid stock phrases and cliches when framing goodwill statements, because these kinds of statements encourage your readers to view your goodwill as disposable. This includes phrases like, "I hope this email finds you well," a notorious opening for emails, and if you have any questions or concerns, do not hesitate to let me know, a notorious closing for emails. Avoid both of these and many other stock phrases and cliches, because again, they encourage your readers to view your goodwill as disposable. If you need a reminder to avoid stock phrases and cliches in your goodwill statements, please consider this meme. This is one of my all-time favorite memes, and I want to assure you that if you do ever send me an email that begins with, "I hope this finds you well," this is the meme that you will get in response. So what can you use to replace these generic statements of goodwill? That's, of course, a good question. Thank you for asking. The best way to replace these statements is with more specific, more carefully tailored, more personalized messages of goodwill. Instead of "I hope this finds you well," which is empty and vague, instead refer to events that have recently transpired in your reader's life. I hope you enjoyed your trip to Milwaukee and are making good progress on the TPS report. Instead of saying, please don't hesitate to contact me with questions, you can instead say, if you'd like to propose changes to the report, please stop by my office, 115R, between 2 and 4 p.m. on Tuesday or Thursday. This kind of specific, tailored language will make your reader feel valued and will make your Goodwill feel specific and sincere. Now, once again, I'd like to look at a sample message that fails to heed the foregoing advice. And as with the previous message, I don't want to read it aloud. Instead, I'd like you to quit out of the audio lecture, take a few moments to read this message carefully, and then resume the audio lecture at the next slide once you've read the message. As with the previous message, this message has a wide variety of problems. Perhaps the most obvious is the fact that the message does not motivate action. It does not indicate what action the writer wants the reader to take after finishing the message. Instead, the closest that we get to a main point is the sentence highlighted in red. I've got some updates. That's great, but what do you want the reader to do? That's the real question. The next major issue with this message involves the repeated lapses in parallel phrasing in the middle of the document. In that first bullet point, we begin with a transition with the word first, followed by a standard subject-verb-object sentence. Then in the second, we have a transition again, second, followed by a command. And then in the third, we've omitted the transition altogether. And while we have a complete sentence, a standard statement, as we did in the first bullet point, it now uses an abstract subject. Instead of focusing on a person, place, or thing capable of action, we instead have this phrase, acquisition of the device, as the subject of the sentence. And so because of these repeated lapses in parallel phrasing, we're slowing down. We have to recalibrate our reading for each new structure that we encounter in the course of this bulleted list. Another problem with this message is the fact that the writer has introduced too much variety into the message. The writer is trying to use too many synonyms for the same terms, and as a result, the message feels diffuse. It feels confusing. We oftentimes feel lost as the reader. To understand why, take a look at some of this color coding. The writer is using the words buy, purchase, and acquisition to refer to the same concept. They're using the words printer, it, and the device to refer to the same object. They're using funds, allocation, reserve, and resources to refer to the same concept. And they're using Q3 and period to refer to the same period of time. Now, again, a little bit of variety can be good. There's a reason why our high school and college English and literature teachers taught us to use it. But if we use it to excess, as this writer did, then we limit our reader's ability to make connections between disparate elements in our writing. Lastly, this message begins and ends with incredibly stale, generic, and cliché goodwill. It starts out with, I hope this finds you well, and it ends with, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and touch base. We've got that double whammy of meaningless business babble at the end of the message. So to effectively revise this message, we're going to have to deal with all of these errors. And we've dealt with them in a number of different ways. So first, you'll notice that the subject line is now far more action-oriented. It focuses on the action that the writer wants the reader to take. It then begins with a quick statement of context before moving on to the main point, which again is rephrased, is reframed as a call to action. The three middle bullet points are not only more specific, but they maintain parallel phrasing, and they use strategic repetition to draw links between different elements in the document. And finally, the document closes with some good, specific, personalized Goodwill. Finally, let's move on to our section on best practices for business diction, how you can choose the most appropriate words for a business or workplace communication context. My first tip is quite simple, but it's nevertheless quite powerful. And the tip is to use polite, casual, specific language in business, in workplace communication contexts. I should also note that this slide always pains me a little bit as a great lover of neckties, and yet it seemed the most effective way to represent the importance of using casual language in workplace settings. What practically does this injunction to use polite, casual, specific language mean? Perhaps the best way to think about it is to compare it to dress. Is the appropriate level of formality, is it athleisure and streetwear? Is it formal wear? Or is it business casual? Not surprisingly, the right approach is, of course, business casual. That is the kind of language that we want to use in business communication. Language that is a little bit polished, but still conversational, still very much yourself, your everyday self. What we want to avoid is language like what we see in the example on the left, language that feels legalistic or excessively academic. Now, I know that oftentimes it feels tempting to use language like this. You might feel that language like this shows respect for your reader, or it shows the appropriate gravitas for the situation. But ultimately, this kind of language, it's just boring, it's dense, it's hard to read, and it does not meet your needs, or more importantly, your readers. Instead, we want to use plain, specific, conversational language like what we see in the revised text on the right. This revised text, it has several features that set it apart from the text on the left. First of all, it's much shorter. That's obviously a great asset. Secondly, it uses simpler words. We don't see a lot of the $64 million words that we saw in the original text. And most importantly, it organizes each sentence around a person. You'll notice the recurrence of the personal pronoun you in the revised text. This is a huge reason why it's so much more readable, and it corresponds to the way that we tend to use language in everyday speech. When we're talking to friends, when we're talking to colleagues, when we're talking to family, we use personal pronouns. We don't organize our sentences around big abstract concepts. And so when you're writing in a professional context, to make your writing sound conversational, adopt those personal pronouns, that human language, as much as possible. The next tip is this: avoid cliches, slang, and jargon. Now, each of these items is problematic for a slightly different reason. Cliches and slang are oftentimes very regionally or linguistically specific. As such, they are ill-suited for communicating in international settings or for individuals who are not native or fluent English language speakers. Cliches are oftentimes boring. They encourage your reader to treat your writing as disposable. Slang can oftentimes be perceived as rude or unprofessional. And jargon is oftentimes deeply alienating. It almost feels sometimes as if you're using language to express your own intelligence or superiority rather than to achieve a communication goal. Now, there is a time and place for jargon. If you're communicating with other professionals in your field and you're using jargon as a shorthand for a complex technical concept that would be too difficult to describe in plain language, then by all means use the jargon. But only use jargon when you know that your audience is going to understand what it is that you're saying. I trust that all of you have had ample experience with jargon in your professional and academic lives, but in case you need yet another example of jargon, here it is. And here's an example of how we could revise that text to make it more reader-friendly, to avoid the jargon and cliches that weighed down and burdened the previous version. Next, be earnest in your written communication. As much as possible, banish sarcasm from your writing. Now, as a great lover of sarcasm, this tip pains me somewhat, but it is nevertheless good and solid advice. Tone is incredibly hard to incorporate into your writing, and even the best readers will oftentimes misconstrue the intended tone of a document. And so, as much as possible, particularly in a business setting where your readers are navigating your document very, very quickly, try to be as plain as possible with your meaning. On the left, we have a message that is practically dripping in snark. And while it is admittedly quite amusing, it is only amusing because we are not on the receiving end of this message. If we were in fact Terry, the person receiving this message, we would likely be quite upset because this message comes across as rude, sarcastic, and grating. Instead, we should opt for language like what we see on the right. Language that is plain, direct, and earnest. This is perhaps less fun in some ways, but it is definitely more polite and certainly safer. And finally, my last tip for this lecture, avoid trying to sound smart. If you try to sound smart, your writing will become overblown. It will become cumbersome. It will become jargon-laden. Instead, just be yourself, but be your best self. Be polished, but sound conversational. If you do that, your writing will be clear, it will be direct, and it will be inviting. Thanks for listening.